Hello everybody, welcome to Movies by McManus, the channel where we break down movies, comics, TV, books, whatever kind of media you're into, in the context of who created it and what effect it's trying to have on the world. And today we're going to be breaking down the 2021 film The Many Saints of Newark, directed by Alan Taylor. The Many Saints of Newark is the prequel film to the HBO TV series The Sopranos, which, if you've watched this channel, you would know that my brother and myself are huge fans of. And, like Dr. Death last week, it's a film that I personally worked on, which, being a huge fan of the show, was very exciting for me. But even calling this a Sopranos prequel film is a bit misleading, because The Many Saints of Newark is its own contained story, and while it has many of the same characters as The Sopranos, it doesn't do much to actually set up the events we would later see in the show. In fact, one of the main complaints I have with how this movie was advertised is that it was set up to be a Tony Soprano origin story, and that is most definitely not the case. While teenage Tony does play a major part in this film, his struggles and his turn to gangsterism is more of a side plot. The film does not center around Tony, and doesn't do much to set up the Sopranos. And this film centers around Dickie and his relationship with his family, specifically his father. Even the name Moltisanti translates in Italian to many saints, so we could see by the title of this film that this movie is not about the Sopranos, but about the Moltisantis. A major theme in this film is tension between fathers and sons, which parallels the first season of The Sopranos, which dealt with a tense mother-son relationship. And we see two different tense father-son relationships in this film. First between Dickie Moltisanti and his father, and also between Tony Soprano and his father, Johnny Soprano. Dickie despises his father. As a kid, his dad was abusive to him and his mother, and is now abusive to his current wife, Josefina. But because of Italian tradition, he still feels as though he needs to respect his dad. Ironically, we see that Dickie's father is someone who doesn't even deserve respect. He's crass and obnoxious, and Dickie has even risen up to a higher level in the mafia than his dad ever had. Eventually, Dickie murders his father after confronting him about abusing his current wife, and after his death, takes on his father's wife, his stepmother, as his mistress. Yet despite this, we see that Dickie is actively trying to not become like his father. He's constantly saying he wants to be a good person, implying that his dad was the type of bad person that he doesn't want to be. But along the way, we see that Dickie becomes exactly like his dad, including becoming abusive and eventually murdering his mistress, Josefina, the same woman that Dickie killed his father trying to protect. At the same time, if we look at the character of Tony Soprano, while he may not despise his father the way that Dickie does, we see that Johnny Soprano is a cold and distant dad, and not the type of person who Tony would relate to or look up to in any way. Tony certainly doesn't see Johnny as any type of role model, and looks up more to Dickie as a father figure. Dickie, or at least Tony's perceived version of Dickie, is more the man that Tony wants to grow up to be. However, while we see Dickie slowly becoming exactly like his dad, we also know that by the time the events of The Sopranos take place, Tony Soprano has become exactly like his father as well. In a lot of ways, adult Tony Soprano is just as cold to his son AJ and disrespectful to his wife Carmela as Johnny ever was to Tony and his mother. Not only that, but we see the cycle continue to Christopher. By the end of the series The Sopranos, Christopher has become exactly like his dad and grandfather, being a domestic abuser and eventually having his fiancée murdered. Another major theme of this film is tensions between Black and Italian neighborhoods in Newark in the 1960s, especially in the context of organized crime. Early in the film, we see the 1967 Newark riots, the result of rising tensions between the Black community and the police department, with the final straw being when a Black cab driver, John William Smith, was beaten by two white police officers after driving the wrong way down a one-way street. This took place during the height of white flight in New Jersey and New York, where white families were moving away from the city and to the suburbs, taking a lot of the money with them, as Black families moved into their neighborhoods. The Sopranos family themselves take part in this white flight, when Johnny makes his family move to the suburbs after a Black family moves in down the block from them, even fighting with his brother Junior for not trying to stop the Black family from moving in. This parallels real-life gangsters like Carmine Fatico in East New York and Whitey Bulger in Boston, who actively fought to try to prevent Black families from moving into white neighborhoods. In a later scene in the series The Sopranos, Tony takes his son to a Newark neighborhood that used to be Italian middle class, that is now primarily Black, and run down and filled with crime. Tony Soprano, who grows up to be a racist just like his father, blames the Black families who moved in for not keeping the neighborhood alive, when the reality is that most of the white families who left owned all the houses and businesses in those areas, meaning when they left, the money went with them. This affected the world of organized crime as well. During the 60s and 70s, many Black gangsters became tired of the Italians running everything and taking all the money for themselves. Though this sentiment wasn't exclusive to just Black gangsters. As we talked about in our video on the Westies, during this time, many Irish gangsters also rebelled against the Mafia's rule. In comes the character of Harold, a Black gangster who, after realizing how one-sided his relationship with the Italian Mafia is, decides to go into business for himself, starting a war against Dickie and his Mafia crew. Harold is being backed by real-life gangster Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas's inclusion in this film is important for historical purposes. The real-life Frank Lucas took over longtime Harlem boss Bumpy Johnson's criminal enterprise in the 1960s. While Bumpy Johnson had a long-standing relationship with the Italian Mafia, specifically gangster Charlie Luciano, it became clear that the Italians were actually Bumpy's bosses, rather than his partners. When Frank Lucas took over, he decided to take the drug trade back for himself, starting his own smuggling operation independent of the Italian Mafia, and quickly becoming their enemy. Through the Many Saints of Newark, we see a mirroring of real-life events. Harold doesn't just represent Black gangsters who were tired of the Mafia's control, but also Black civilians who were tired of the white residents of Newark owning all the property. And we see by the end of the movie that Harold's criminal enterprise is now so successful, he's able to buy a house in the majority white neighborhoods of Newark. Now, since Harold doesn't appear in The Sopranos, we can only speculate what happens to him after this film. And typically, for gangsters who fight against the Mafia, things don't end well. Even Frank Lucas himself was eventually arrested and turned government informant. And many of those Irish gangsters during this time were either killed or sentenced to life in prison. But the same can really be said for any gangster. As we talked about in an earlier video when we broke down The Sopranos, these are all doomed characters. That a violent death or life in prison is the price you pay for joining the mafia. And Dickie Moltisanti is no different. The film ends with Dickie Moltisanti being murdered. But we already know from the beginning that Dickie's life is going to end violently. Dickie made the decision to live a doomed life the second he decided to join the mob. And in the final scene, we see Tony Soprano making that same decision. And in the final words of the movie, we hear Dickie's son Christopher tell us from beyond the grave, "That's my Uncle Tony. That's the man I went to hell for." So, reactions to this movie were actually pretty mixed. But personally, I really enjoyed this film just as a fan of The Sopranos, a fan of storytelling, and someone who's interested in the real-life historical aspects of gangsterism. So, if you have your own opinion on the Many Saints of Newark or The Sopranos in general, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you like this video, subscribe to our channel, check out our podcast, and follow us on social media at Movies by McManus. I'm your host, Greg, and have a good night.